Craig, welcome to the Ultrahabits show. For those that don't know, we've had some technical issues in the morning, but we have arrived. Hopefully, not overly stressed out, but these things happen with technology these days. So, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, RJ, it's a pleasure. Good to be
Yeah,
here.
yeah. So, we're going to talk about founders today and startups. So, I was introduced to you by Matthew Barbito. I know a few people that move within the realm of your program. Before we go into, founder stuff, how did you come to the idea about starting the Upside Founders Program? Like, what drove that?
So, look, what drove it was an appreciation of, I guess, first of all, some of the difficulties that founders face. So, I've been a founder myself, um, and I know what it's like to be living with a kind of constant existential threat, and sometimes the impact that has on your own behaviours and your own relationships. And a lot of those impacts can be unmitigated, pretty damaging and destructive. Uh, and because I think, I'm older than most founders and I've done a few things, I've sort of seen that pattern repeat itself, not only with founders, but with other people that are working with a lot of intensity and working under a lot of pressure. And so my interest was really about trying to help founders avoid some of those missteps and some of those mistakes, and to develop some skills that might help them perform at a very high level for all the many years that it's going to take them to build the business that they want to build.
What were some of those missteps and behaviors that you were operating with and took when you were a founder that were suboptimal?
Yeah, so look, fortunately, by the time I founded a tech business, I'd learned a bit and I put some sort of firm boundaries around it. But if I go back into sort of previous incarnations, some of the things that I did were, overwork is one. That's a very common one. Consequences of overwork is that you underdo a lot of other aspects of your life. You undersleep. I know these aren't really proper words, but I think they'll make sense. You're gonna under exercise. You're gonna under eat in terms of basic nutrition. Or you may actually overeat, but you're gonna kind of be under eating in terms of the quality of the things that you're putting into your body. And that will include usually a whole bunch of stuff that ain't that good for you, like too much coffee. In my case, I spent many years chain smoking in between running triathlons, which was kind of ridiculous. But as you think you're bulletproof when you're young, alcohol, other chemicals that you might lean on. And you're going to underdo your relationships with the people that matter most to you, like your friends and your family, particularly family. So you're going to kind of under parent, you're going to under husband or wife or, all those sort of things are some of the knock-on consequences of overcommitting yourself to building a business. And where I'm going with this is that it becomes a very poor investment. So the kind of returns you're getting from that level of time and energy being focused and expended on something, those returns diminish. And actually, at a certain point, I think they become counterproductive.
Mm. It's interesting. I was talking about entrepreneurship with a friend a long time ago. This conversation I will not forget. We're just talking about the DNA of an entrepreneur. And I would get you to validate this, but she made this comment, which I agree with, that to some extent, an entrepreneur is someone that's kind of unhappy with the status quo, like when they're in professional land, right? There's something there that isn't satisfied. And I think that's a tricky thing, right? Because a lot of people may get into startup because they're inherently dissatisfied. And do you find that a lot of people feel that the success of their venture is going to make them happier? Like, how much do they tie that up with with their sense of
Yeah, look,
happiness?
yeah, for sure, for sure. And look, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that there is a level of obsession that is required to build something from scratch. And there is a tremendous amount of hard work that is required. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that there's an easier path and it doesn't require a lot of blood, sweat and tears. It does. I guess what I am saying, though, is that there is a much more effective balance to be struck than most people consider. And so where it gets unhealthy, and yes, I think there's a discontent with the status quo. I think there's an itch that entrepreneurs want to scratch. And what a wonderful thing. And that is energizing, motivating. That's kind of what, in some respects, keeps people going. And it's a requirement, I would say, in many cases. So, I totally agree with that. I think that the question is kind of how you execute, knowing that, and knowing that however strong those urges and motivations may be, that you're still human and there are still limits to what your kind of mortal form can endure. And if you develop healthier habits, which is sort of, right in your wheelhouse here, but if you develop healthy habits and you kind of train yourself properly, you actually find that your capacities go up, your capacities for hard work, your capacities for focus, your ability to hit, say, flow states. And so the opportunity for, I don't even like using the word balance, I think a better alignment of all your resources so that you can marshal them to pursue this thing that you want to do. I think there's just smarter strategies for doing that than most people have sort of considered.
You just touched on something that I'm going to really dive into here, because it's something that even for me is relevant. Like, it's easy for me to release the beast, but the question is, how do I then manage that in how I relate to the rest of the world, i.e. people, my family, integration. Like, for me, it's easy to, if I had no one in my life, I could redline quite easily and then find a way to balance it out. But with all the complexities of living a human life and relationships and trying to move with somewhat grace, it's challenging. So what are some of the things within your program? Let's say that we're accepting to do a startup. We have to release that beast. There has to be some level of obsession that we have to embrace to be successful. How do we ring fence that?
I do, and I'm not trying to trip you up here, RJ. I just kind of think it's interesting. I have a sort of a mild obsession of my own with the language around business and performance, and I think it's really interesting that so much of it borrows from military language, sometimes sporting language, very masculine language, and even the phrase "release the beast" is an interesting phrase, right? Or when you talk about redlining, like kind of revving dangerously. Putting your whole race at risk because you're pushing the engine in this case, but all the componentry to its absolute limit, as if that's a smart strategy for winning the race, right? And actually, it's probably not a very smart strategy for winning the race, because you might win 1 out of 10, but 9 out of 10 times you're just going to end up in the pits or on the side of the track. And we know that. We know that most startups fail. We know actually that most small businesses fail. They fail to become medium-sized businesses. They mostly knock themselves out in 2 years. And yet, so we've got all this sort of compelling evidence that the kind of business as usual approach to building something does not work well, is a very unreliable method. And usually ends in disappointment or tears. And yet we don't think about that a lot, because I think that we view ourselves as an exception. I mean, I'll give you an example of this, right? So, I deal with founders a lot, and, they're all very intelligent people, and they all understand that typically to build a business and get it to a point where you might be able to exit or IPO or execute a trade sale is 10, 15 years on average. But of course, what does a highly motivated and fiercely intelligent and often competitive founder think? They go, well, yeah, but that's the average, and I'm not average. It's not going to take me that long. And so, you conduct yourself typically in the early years, like it's not going to take that long, and you make decisions because you think I'll be done in 5, and I can afford to postpone a lot of these things that I know are important to me for 5 years. I'll get away with it, and then I'll kind of, I'll re-engineer myself at that point, or I'll redeem myself somehow with my family and my friends at that point. But it's just, they're averages for a reason. And every founder is, typically highly motivated, highly intelligent, extremely conscientious, skews towards extroversion, and also mildly neurotic. And that's, that's sort of just standard issue stuff. Yeah.
Standard issue, bro. There's a military word there.
Yeah.
How then do founders, like, what are the mechanisms you guys focus on to help ring fence all these qualities that are quite intense to make sure that they don't actually incinerate the founder themselves?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. I think like context is so important, and kind of setting context. And so one of the kind of raw truths and difficult realities for most founders, I think, is that they're kind of always on. So they're always on, possibly, as you suggest, because they're obsessed and fixated, and there's a level of that is a requirement. They're also always on because people around them, for the most part, the people around them are looking to them and forming opinions, making judgments. There's something always at stake. There's money at stake. There's kind of an immediate need to raise money, and therefore a lot of the people you're hanging around with are potential investors or re-investors in your business. Because talent is so competitive, the good talent to get them into your company, you're kind of always on in that sense too. You're kind of always recruiting. You're always building your employer brand. You're always sort of pitching to the room in case there's someone who's thinking about making a shift and they might want to jump your way. Yeah. And so one of the things that we set out to do from the very, very beginning is create a different context. We have an expression which is to be deeply unimpressive, which is counterintuitive for people who are fundamentally impressive humans. They've often got like stellar academic records and PhDs in something, or maybe they dropped out of school at 14, but they've already started 5 businesses and, made a few million already, one way or another. Or they've come out of a sporting background, they've been to the Olympics and they know, what hard work discipline is really about. So typically founders are very impressive people by all conventional measures. But when we encourage them to be deeply unimpressive, what we mean by that is kind of just let go. Like, there is no money in this room. There's no customers in this room. If you stop being impressive for a moment, what you open up is a possibility of building much deeper connections with the other people around you. And sure as eggs, you're going to be short on real connections in your life. Because one of the things that, pursuing the building of this business will almost certainly guarantee for most founders is that those relationships suffer. And a lot of people that you might regard as great friends, because when you were both knocking around at McKinsey's or Bain or BCG or wherever you might have been, let's say, as an example, you're still great friends with those people. But, an expression I hear a lot from founders is they just don't get it. They don't get it anymore. And, the difference between being a founder and having a job is that, you can do a reasonable job and you get paid the same. And unless you're doing a terrible job, you probably still got a job. But everything's so precarious in a startup. If you don't do an outstanding job, you won't have a startup in a minute, because you'll burn through the cash and no one will stump up any more for you. So it's a much more dangerous way to operate for a lot of people. And so having context where you are psychologically safe and you can say what you want and you can be fallible and your foibles are okay here and people aren't going to judge you, or even if they do quietly judge you, there's no penalty for that.
Yeah.
You're not in any way impeding your own progress or doing any kind of reputational harm here.
Context determines meaning, and I think it's really important. So, like, we say we now have the context set in terms of how the founders, they've adopted that philosophy in terms of how they're facing the world. What are some of the key things within your program that you guys would focus on in terms of just habits and things like practical stuff like meditation? Like, what are some of the foundational stuff that you guys tend to orientate your founders towards?
Yeah. Well, thanks, RJ. That too is a great question. What we do is we try and flip the convention. So what I mean by the convention is nobody like consciously would articulate what I'm about to say as like the absolute surefire go-to recipe for success. Because when I say it out loud, you'll go, well, that's just stupid, right? But this is what typically happens is that people work every hour that God sends them, and they go, if I keep doing this, I'll get it to the stage where I can afford to employ some other people to put around me to do some of this stuff. And they get to that stage and they employ some other people to do some of that stuff. And the first surprise is I thought it was going to get easier, but far out. People are complicated, aren't they? And they're so demanding and needy, and they need attention and they need direction, and and we need to think about culture. We need to think more about processes and work practices, and all that is demanding in new ways. And so it doesn't get easier; it gets more complex. And then if you keep going, you think, well, at some stage I'll have the luxury of more time, because as I hand off certain responsibilities to this team that I'm arraying around me, I'll have more time to work on the business, not in it, to be more strategic or do the things that I'm deeply passionate about and very good at in the business. But that time never comes. And meanwhile, people are not taking care of themselves. And so energetically, cognitively, in terms of emotional intelligence, all these things, their own performance falls away, and they're role modeling really bad behavior to the people that with great effort and expense they've managed to bring into the business. And now they're a really shitty role model for a business which turns out, that's contagious and then does not fulfill its potential. So, of course, when I say it like that, people go, well, that's an idiotic way to do things. Well, yes, it is. And also, but it's the way that many startup founders are operating, and no surprise that a lot of startup businesses limp along and disappoint or fail. And so the first thing we do is go, let's just re-examine that. So we're not trying to, pitch people a formula. We're just saying, I think it's probably time that you entertain some other things that might be good for you. And it's for you to determine the things that are really good for you and not. But those things might be simple stuff like sleep. So everyone knows, yeah, sleep's really important. And I read Matthew Walker's book and I've seen his TED talk, and yep, I buy it. And yet most people are not getting what Matthew Walker would recommend, is the 4 cycles of sleep, which is, roughly speaking, 8 hours a night for most people, give or take a bit. And so, sleep's traded off, and then there's lots of consequences around just that one thing. I'll give you an example of this, actually. So we give everyone Oura rings so that they can measure and manage their sleep like they haven't been able to before. And of course, because you're getting data every day, what's really interesting with founders is they come into the room with their Oura ring and they start getting competitive about it. What was your sleep score?
Right.
How's your readiness score? What time are you going to bed?
That's the challenge with data, man. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Kind of obsessing about it in a whole new way. But actually, I kind of regard that as a very healthy obsession. Right? Actually, they're thinking about, sleep. But one of the things that's so great about it, I can remember last year, one of the founders saying, sort of, 9 months into this, he said, I just want to say to the room, I just want to say to everybody that I can now prove, I can demonstrate that I'm getting 20 minutes more sleep a night. And it might not sound like a lot, but let me tell you how that translates into my world. He said, first of all, I'm a better leader for my team. I'm making better decisions. I'm more decisive. I'm clearer. I have more time and attention for them. And I know their feedback about me has improved out of sight. He said, maybe more importantly, at the beginning of the year, I was engaged. I had a fiance, and here we are 9 months into the year, and she still wants to marry me. And I put that down to sleep because I was a bit of an ass before that. And, just things that are kind of that simple, but that powerful are really important. And for him, it was that extra 20 minutes sleep that is, he recognizes having this kind of profound effect on his performance and his relationships. Just to stick with sleep, I had another founder a couple of years earlier just say, well, I just made one decision. I'm just going to bed at 10 o'clock and I'm winding down at 9:30 and I'm just doing that. And it's just made such a difference to the next day for me. And so because I know that it's working for me, that has become a habit. So sleep is one. Exercise is another. So again, you don't have to be an athlete, but remembering that you have a body and remembering it's not just a vehicle for transporting your head around, and that there's other things it can do and enjoys doing and benefits from, and that it does, a little bit of exercise will sharpen up a whole bunch of stuff for you, including your energy levels. Meditation, we get into sort of this intersection of mindfulness, meditation, neuroscience, and emotional intelligence. They're all, I'm not trying to lump them together like they're one thing, but they have a very interesting dynamic. And so we explore each of them a little. But principally, what we help people appreciate is that some of these practices that have been around for thousands of years, we can now measure because of neuroscience, because the fidelity of measurement and our understanding of how brains work, they're how you can change both their kind of form and function because they're plastic. Our understanding of that is just improving daily, and our ability to measure changes in brain structure and function is improving daily. And so you can evidence the benefits. You can point to what's actually happening in brains now that we couldn't do 10, 15, 20 years ago, and certainly not 2,000 years ago. So, some of the great practitioners of contemplative practices, and famous practitioners through history were kind of clearly onto something. It's now Western science is starting to catch up with that, which makes it more easier to accept for a lot of people. And again, a lot of founders are very data-driven and sciencey by nature, and there's evidence for this. And so the evidence helps people entertain some of these practices, and some of those people who entertain them go on to turn them into habits.
Yeah, I had a conversation yesterday, and this gentleman, Chuck, has been a guest on my podcast. He's ex-VP of Oura Ring. We're actually trying to understand how we can get more of this data into businesses here in Australia, whether or not the market would be receptive to that kind of performance approach, instead of kind of getting businesses to sit in a workshop and hoorah and, give them shit Mentos food and all that stuff for the day. Like, how do we actually do something that's value driven over time, and whether or not the Australian market would have an appetite for that? And obviously you're doing that within your founder program, but would businesses at mass be willing to really lift the hood on that level of visibility? Would people participate because of data privacy issues? Obviously people that come to your program are willing participants because they're interested. Would a business want their boss to see that they've been binge doing cocaine for 5 days? You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a whole,
yeah.
You know what I mean, mate? But
yeah, but look, there's degrees of that, right? And I think that you don't have to turn it into a surveillance exercise. I mean, you could, if if company A decided we're going to give everyone an Aura ring and, they're expensive, so let us know if you don't want one. But if you say you do, then we'd totally encourage you to use it. And the good folk at Aura are going to help you understand, we'll organise their onboarding's really good anyway. It's pretty intuitive kit, but, we'll help you understand exactly, how this thing works and why it's so clever and how to get the most out of it, and over to you. I mean, even, that might seem like an extravagant thing for a company to do, but I'd venture to suggest actually, I've just seen it's great technology, and I've just seen it impact so many people positively that that'd be a pretty good thing for a lot of companies to do for their people. And you don't have any visibility of whether people are sleeping well or not. It's, Aura would tell you that, if you wanted to make a study of the data, and you can set up a Teams app where whoever's, an admin in that app can see how people are sleeping. If you want to get sciencey about it, you can probably tell if people are pregnant, or you can tell, or it would say that you could tell when someone's got COVID, for example. But that's getting creepy. And I think that there's a lot of individuals who would go, I don't want my company to see that, right? I don't want them to kind of see my sex life. Well, of course, fair enough. But that doesn't mean that it's not a good idea for the company to support better sleep practices in across their team.
Yeah, we were originally talking because I had an introduction by a gentleman by the name of Charlie Engel. He's in recovery. He's one of the first kind of OG ultra runners. He ran across the whole Sahara. And he's always doing crazy stuff, and he's a wheeler and dealer. And he spoke to me a couple months ago, and he's like, yeah, these guys, these ex-Aura guys have this ability to potentially see, we were talking about people coming out of rehabs off of addiction, to kind of give them this technology which would enable people that are monitoring to that to know if they would potentially going to relapse, right? Like, so, and I was like, wow, okay, the implication of that, because I'm in recovery too. So I thought, well, that could be massive, right? And that's kind of how this whole conversation started. But I want to go back to one of the things you talked about, which I think is really important when you were talking about this piece on sleep. So one of the things that I do, and it's been controversial, particularly when I worked in a company with people that I wasn't necessarily the founder, I was a shareholder, but you've had a responsibility to other people that didn't necessarily have the same philosophy as you. But something that I've always been very strong on is that, my day is designed around three things. That's sleep, exercise, and time with family. My work is actually designed around that, not the other way around. And that has always that's always come at that's been a bit controversial depending on who is working with me, right? Like people that operate on that inside out approach, they appreciate that, they respect that. And for me, it's really important, when I do my scheduling on a Sunday, I know where I'm going to be, how much am I sleeping, where and how am I going to interact with my family, and when am I exercising? And I actually design everything around that. And I think it's very easy, though, when you get pulled in the hustle and bustle of work to start to kind of erode at those things that are key and that you value. One of the things I want to ask you about is the role of family. Now, these founders that you typically come across, are there spouses or partners? Because I think the primary relationship is very important, right? Like, how that is going, it really impacts how we as business people are going. Like, is that relationship challenging? Like, do you find in general that people have supportive partners, or does it become a bit adversarial? And what's that whole space look like, given your whole view of so many founders?
Yeah, look, I would say that I'm guessing here, but I would say at least 75, 80% of the founders that I'm dealing with have some significant other in their life. And the reason that is, is because the founders that I'm working with are usually somewhere between 3 and 13 years into their journey. I think 3 was the youngest, 13's been the most. So let's say 7 or 8 years on average. So they may well not have had a partner at the beginning of this journey because they were younger. But, life continues to roll on and in many ways, things change more radically than we anticipate. And so having a partner, maybe having children in many cases, that becomes part of the reality they're dealing with. Interesting. I mean, I've got no insight really into whether those relationships are healthy and supportive in any really intimate way. But what I would say, that it comes up, of course, and I think most of those relationships are at times strained by the demands of the business and maybe the lack of clear boundary setting that founders have in the beginning, often. And I've even had founders say to me, this happened last year actually, one founder said after our first couple of days together, he said, "Hey, Craig, I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but I think it'd be really great if you ran this sort of a program for partners." And we had a little bit of a chat about it, and I had a chat about it with my team as well. Could we do that? And maybe one day we will. I'm not sure that we should do it with partners separate to the founder. So a female founder with a male or female partner. I think it's better that we do it together than we go, "Hey, partners, step this way," because that feels like it's outside that primary relationship, and I think the work would be more effective if everyone was in the room together.
Yeah.
But actually, let me come back to something you touched on earlier when you asked that question about how you structure your work around these other important aspects of your life, and how that's not always easy when you're working in a team of other people who don't do that or don't want to do that, or maybe a boss who is much more into input than output. I think that's changed a lot, actually. I mean, courtesy of COVID and people working from home, I think people have started to better understand that turning up at the office is not a measure of productivity. It's, your work product is a better indication, the quality and the volume, and the degree of difficulty in achieving it. Those sort of things are more important, and maybe even outcomes over outputs more important, so the impact of that work on the business or the team. So I think there's a better understanding of that sort of stuff now.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Now, we're going to start to land the plane here because I know that we have a hard stop shortly. It's been a terrific, impactful interview. Sometimes having shorter interviews is actually better because you just get straight into it. Landing this plane, one of the things that we always ask our guest is something kind of habit orientated, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a habit, but it could be a way of operating or a way of facing the world. But, say you were to give a new founder one piece of advice, what would that advice be, Craig, based on just the collective exposure you've had to this world and for such a long time?
Well, the simple and slightly general advice, but because it's slightly general doesn't make it any less true, I would say. Because people ask me a version of that question often. What's the most important thing I could do? What's the best bit of advice you've ever had about, and so on. So my answer is simple, which is self-care. So if you don't take care of yourself, and whatever that might mean for you, right? So, my version of self-care is different to yours, and anyone listening, their version of what's important in terms of self-care for them will be different. And that's all great, as long as you make a serious effort to understand what it is that you need to care for yourself, and then make sure that is absolutely sacrosanct. So, you've got to preserve the time and the space and the importance of that. And probably in a small startup team, or any team, you should not be in any way apologetic or afraid to share that with people. Because what you want to be doing is you want to be, this is about the difference between virtues and values, right? So most companies will have a shiny set of values that they kind of go, look at us, and we're into, ingenuity and passion and humility, whatever it might be. And I'm not poo-pooing those things. They're really important. But what's more important is that a founder role models those things. And in truth, those things should be virtues of the founder in the first place, or informed by the virtues of the founders. That has an enormous positive and radiating effect on a culture and the performance of a business. But if you wind this right back to if you're not caring for yourself, you're never going to be role modeling those virtues, because you're going to be some hollowed out facsimile, some kind of, disappointing version of yourself. And so after that, everything becomes suboptimal. So just don't do it. That's way too high a price to pay. So whatever it is for you that matters to you and is about caring for yourself, that has to be protected, nurtured, supported.
Excellent. And so, Craig, where can our audience learn more about your program?
If they go to founderprograms.com, they can learn more about the program. And actually, we've just launched another one called Upside for Teams. So we don't want to keep all this kind of secret sauce wholly and solely for founders. But their teams are every bit as human as they are, and would benefit from aspects of this learning and exposure and experience. So we've just opened it up to startup teams as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Craig. We really are grateful for the time, man.
Wonderful. Thanks for the chat, RJ.